HBC family, welcome to our Easter week devotional series. Welcome back to our Easter week devotional series as we consider Tuesday, March 31st, AD 33 in this series on the final days of Jesus. So we're going to begin with this brief video explaining the events of today.
We now come to Tuesday, March 31st, AD 33. You'll remember on Palm Sunday, Jesus had made his triumphal entry into Jerusalem. And then on Monday, he'd made quite the scene, declaring the temple to be not a house of prayer, as it was intended, but rather a den of thieves. All of this combined to put Jesus on an inevitable collision course with the Jewish authorities, and he spends all of Tuesday interacting with them, meeting their objections, raising questions of his own. But what exactly made the Jewish leaders so mad? What exactly were their objections against Jesus? Why precisely was he viewed as such a threat? And at this point in time, before Calvary, what were their options and what was their strategy?
At every moment during Passion Week, the leaders were watching Jesus, but they were watching him in order to show him to be wrong. To the Pharisees, Jesus was still the kid from Nazareth, who was to them still a young man. And here was this young man making these absolute claims, and he had never been trained. So Jesus was an uneducated Jewish upstart kid who threatened everything that they knew.
When Jesus engineered the house cleaning of the temple, the decommercialization of the temple on Monday, this, of course, was hailed by his Passover pilgrim followers and others. They thought it was great that he had broken the monopoly, at least for one morning or afternoon. Now, this, therefore, put the authorities in something of a panic. Now they somehow have to drive a wedge between Jesus and his followers. Because they really want to get rid of this troublemaker, now also for economic reasons. So they're trying to get Jesus to misspeak himself. And the questions are baited. They can't be answered, really. They're just like the old, can God make a rock so big that he can't lift it himself? See, they're unanswerable, self-defeating questions. And yet, it turns out that Jesus answers everyone correctly.
The Jews had some sort of a semi-autonomous status with regards to their internal political and religious affairs. And so as long as things were calm and peaceful, the Romans allowed the Jews a certain amount of autonomy. But at the same point, the Jewish leaders are beginning to feel that there's something that ought to be done in order for things not to spin out of control with regard to the Roman overlords.
Their entire goal was to find a way to arrest Jesus by stealth. That's why they then had to turn to Judas.
So the readings are quite long today, so I'm going to skip reading the actual text. I think the video does a good job of explaining the essence of what's going on. We've seen on Sunday of Holy Week that on Palm Sunday, Jesus entered Jerusalem and he predicted his death and he visited the temple. We saw that in Matthew 21. And then continuing in Matthew 21, on Monday, Jesus cursed the fig tree and he cleansed the temple. Today's readings from Tuesday is the lesson from the fig tree, Jesus teaching and engaging in the controversies with the religious leaders in the temple, and then Jesus predicting the future. So you see the text there both in Matthew, Mark, and Luke for Tuesday. You can read those on your own. We'll just read the section on the fig tree from Matthew 21, verses 20 and 22. When the disciples saw it, they marveled, saying, "How did the fig tree wither at once?" And Jesus answered them, "Truly I say to you, if you have faith and do not doubt, you will not only do what has been done to the fig tree, But even if you say to this mountain, be taken up and thrown into the sea, it will happen. Whatever you ask in prayer, you will receive it if you have faith. So see, Jesus is contrasting here the response that he's calling for from his disciples from the response he did not receive from the religious leaders, from the Jews who were supposed to be that fertile fig tree that was bearing fruit. Nevertheless, they were rejecting the Messiah, and he's calling upon his disciples to believe in him. So we're going to read an article about the escalating conflict that's taking place on Tuesday of Easter week. And it's now Tuesday morning, March 31st, AD 33. The disciples point to the withered fig tree that Jesus had cursed the day before. Jesus gives his disciples a simple lesson from it: have faith in God. And particularly says that if they have undoubting faith, they can throw even the mountains into the sea. Now, if the disciples had ears to hear, they would recognize that Jesus is talking about more than seemingly magical powers that can curse trees and crumble mountains. He's talking about realities bigger than this. Note that he closes this mini lesson on mountain moving undoubting faith by saying, whenever you stand praying, forgive if you have anything against anyone, so that your Father also who's in heaven may forgive you your trespasses. Jesus reminding them that failing to forgive looms as a bigger obstacle to answered prayer than a mountain. The disciples will soon face greater challenges to their faith and their ability to forgive. Will they remember this withered fig tree on the road from Bethany? As they approach the holy city, the events from the day before could not have been far from their minds. As Jesus enters the Temple Mount, crowds gather to hear him teach, and the chief priests, scribes, and elders waste no time in making their move. They will try to lay 4 traps to ensnare their adversary. Here's the first trap. Whose authority? By whose authority, they demand to know, had Jesus carried out his actions the day before? Jesus doesn't take the bait. Instead, he turns the tables on them with a question of his own. Was the baptism of John from heaven or from man? If they were to respond from heaven, the next question's obvious. Then why don't you believe the one about whom John testifies, which would be Jesus himself? If they retort from man, they risk alienating the crowds that hold John in high esteem as a prophet. So then Jesus offers 3 parabolic stories about sons, murderous tenants, and guests at a wedding feast, all driving home the point that they are rejecting truth, grace and truth, in the service of hypocritical self-righteousness. Trap number 2, whose allegiance? The leaders try a new tactic. They send Pharisees, a Jewish sect known for its zeal for the law, and Herodians, those loyal to Herod's dynasty, to ask him a question: is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not? If Jesus answers yes, then he shatters people's expectations of him as a Messiah who will overthrow Roman rule. But if he says no, he can be arrested for fomenting revolt. But Jesus definitely evades the either-or dilemma. The denarius has Caesar's image on it, and as long as Caesar's in power, it's appropriate to pay taxes to him. And we're also to give God the things that are God. Since we are made in God's image, we owe everything, all that we have and all that we are, to him. Pay your taxes and worship God. So he avoids the second trap. Third trap. Whose wife in the resurrection? After Jesus had silenced the Pharisees and Herodians, the Sadducees, a Jewish sect denying the end-time resurrection of the dead, try to ridicule Jesus' belief in the resurrection by asking a trick question about marriage in heaven. Jesus tells them they don't understand the scriptures. There is no marriage in heaven. Or the power of God, since God is the God of the living and not the dead, of self-affirmation in Exodus 3. Like the others, their smirk turns to marvel as they grow silent. So Jesus once again evades their trap. What about trap 4? Which commandment? Now the Pharisees send forth an expert in the law to question Jesus. Which of God's commands is the greatest? Jesus summarizes it in a word: love, to God and for neighbor. But Jesus discerns something different from this questioner, so he commends and implicitly invites him. You're not far from the kingdom of God. Now it's Jesus' turn to initiate some questions with those who are trying to trap him. When he asked them a question about Psalm 110, verse 1, and how the Messiah can be David's Lord, no one was able to answer him a word, nor from that day did anyone dare to ask him any more questions. Jesus then launches a lengthy, scathing critique of the scribes and Pharisees, pronouncing 7 woes of judgment upon these hypocrites and blind guides. This full-scale verbal assault removes all doubt concerning Jesus' intentions, agenda, and aims. He has no desire to ally himself with the current leadership. He has come to overthrow their authority. There is no way both sides can survive the escalating conflict. Either Jesus will assume power, or he must die. With another tension-filled day behind them, Jesus and the disciples begin to head back to Bethany. They stop on the Mount of Olives to rest, giving them a wonderful view of Jerusalem as the sun begins to set behind it in the west. The disciples marvel at the size and grandeur of these impressive buildings, but Jesus tells them that a day is coming soon when not a single stone will be left upon another. He goes on to explain that his followers will experience increasing persecution and tribulation leading up to the final day of judgment, but their task is to remain vigilant and persist in faith. Tuesday's now done, but Friday is coming. This is not the flannel board Jesus some of us learned as children. This is the real, historical Jesus, fully in control, as he responds with grace and truth to traps on all sides. He knows what he's doing, and he knows what is coming. Every word and every step is for the fame of his Father's name and the salvation of those willing to pick up their cross and die with him. Here's the application for us today, brothers and sisters. This was written by Robert Cunningham, pastor of Tates Creek Presbyterian and a friend of mine, reflecting on Tuesday of Easter week. He writes, "Everything Jesus said on that day conveyed the same thing. You reject me, but I will become the cornerstone of all things. All who reject Jesus will severely regret that choice because in the end they will discover that he's the only thing that can bear the weight of their hopes, longings, desires, identity, indeed their very life. Conversely, all who embrace Jesus will never regret that choice because they will find in him the one thing that can hold them and not fail." That was his claim. And then what Jesus taught in the temple that day, he would soon demonstrate. In 3 days, he would become the ultimate display of rejection, forsaken by man and God upon the cross. And yet the discarded one would then rise from the ashes of rejection on Easter morning, take his rightful place as the cornerstone of all existence. Centuries have passed, and he still is divisive on that day in the temple. The reason, arguments, and accusations against him change with the tides of cultures, but his rejection carries on. To this day, so many fail to recognize him for who he really is. They search in vain for a stone that can bear the weight of their desperate needs, but there is no other stone, only Jesus, the chief cornerstone. But to those who embrace what is foolishness to so many, they have found their rock. They that trust in the despised and rejected one have discovered an unshakable fortress of salvation and life. Indifference is off the table. Jesus of Nazareth is simply too significant to ignore. Today we face the same challenge that was before the people on that Tuesday in the temple. Reject him or embrace him. Choose your stone wisely. Here's the verse I want to leave us with. Matthew 21:44. "And the one who falls on this stone will be broken to pieces, and when it falls on anyone, it will crush him." Better to be broken than crushed.